So we return now to the isolated, tragic figure of the lone thinker who believes that they have no attachments to the world and are entirely autonomous and independently constituted. The manner in which psychology has by and large gone about its business is to construct a picture of what it believes the person to be. So psychologists are drawing their own self-portrait. And as such, the figures of psychology give rise to the notion of the isolated psychological subject. This is essential to our thinking. We've no way around this, but it's also extremely limited. A focus resolutely on constructing the figure of the I, me, blinds us to the importance of our links with others, our collective responsibilities, entanglements, and so on. If you construct an individual figure of the psychological subject, if you regard the person as fully formed and describable in scientific terms, then the domain of human interaction, the social domain, appears by magic as just what happens when these creatures interact. But social forces have a power and an autonomy all of their own, which we neglect at our peril. So psychology, as it's currently constituted, seems very poorly equipped to address questions of our collective being. The field of social psychology is very special in this respect. Now, it's kind of hard to find your balance here, because on the one hand, the descriptions we create of ourselves are very valuable to us, but they also, their shortcomings become woefully apparent very quickly. So we've just lived through the virus. Most of us lived through it, some didn't make it. That's an example of a collective fear, a collective problem. It hit globally, it hit everyone all at the same time, but it hit everyone in very different ways and in very different circumstances with very different effects. At times like that, people turn to psychologists like they turn to priests, faith healers, astrologers. They turn to psychologists because they want someone, for God's sake, to tell them what they should do. And so although the virus might seem to be a question about a very small little quasi-living being, its effects in the human sphere are much more obvious and visible. You don't need a microscope to see them. All the discussion about face masks, the manner in which we were forced to rethink our collective activities, our choirs, churches, sports teams, everywhere joint speech is found, was selectively hit by the virus. We had tremendous trouble reorganizing our working lives, our domestic lives, and schools became a particular problem. And people wanted to know, what's the right way for my child to still be educated in the time of the virus? And so they turned to social psychologists. And social psychologists will provide answers. When you come with questions, because they want to answer questions, they provide answers. But what we need to recognize is that these are very short-term responses to something which is inexorably situated at a particular point in time in history, in particular contexts. So we're going to look at some of the best known social psychology studies. And what we'll find is that because we're looking at them from some distance, we're looking at ones that happened in the past, we'll see that they are one after another catastrophic. We can see that the questions that they ask are very well motivated, but there's something to be learned in the failures of social psychology as well. The first case study we're going to look at, we're going to do that in this video, is Harlow here, a creepy scientist. He worked with these little rhesus macaque monkeys, as so many scientists have done, and he was working mainly in the 1950s. And so in order to understand what his work was about and what fears it was responding to, we need to understand something about the 1950s America. I read my own slide. Um, America in the 1950s, look, in the magazines it looks like this. But let's contextualize the 1950s in America. It's shortly after the end of the Second World War. In the 1920s and the 1930s, there had been huge changes in population in America. And I don't mean just in numbers, I mean in the distribution. People moved, vast numbers of people moved from the countryside to the cities. There were many reasons for this. The Great Depression of 1929 and subsequent years cast people off the land, out of work, and they flocked to the cities. The Dust Bowl was an environmental disaster that hit the Midwestern states of America, and again, hundreds of thousands of people left the land and went to the cities. And World War II had significantly rearranged the population, and there was a great number of returning soldiers that had to be engineered back into society. There was all kinds of social plans and policies and programs to put them back in. So there's been huge changes in population. People are flocking to the cities, and something new happens in city planning here. The suburbs arrive. Suburbs didn't exist before this. Those vast, sprawling areas around cities in which people live in identical little houses. They were new, and they were intensively fostered by a new form of consumerism. The economic engine starting up after the Second World War in America was very powerful. So that kitchen full of its gadgets and appliances is very much of its time. But what's important to realize here is that family structures have just, by and large, been broken. While people were far more distributed around the land, they lived in mixed family circumstances, very often in very large families with contacts to older and younger generations. It was new in the 1950s that people were living as what we now call the nuclear family. The nuclear family, daddy, mammy, 2.5 kids, and a station wagon in the front. This was the new dream, but it has a problem with it, which is that you're cut off from the resources that old generations would have made available to you. People literally forgot how to rear their children. So there you can contrast the America around 1900 with America of the 1950s. Yes, there's bright, shiny toys, there's new kitchens, there's devices, washing machines, but what's gone are the familial attachments. And people didn't know how to raise their children. They turned to an ever more self-confident psychology to ask, how should we rear our children? There was a great appetite for advice. And this is where Harry Harlow's work is situated. He saw himself as studying love, which is very, very nice. He did this by torturing monkeys, which is a little bit strange. Now here's an example of one of the props he used to scare little monkeys. It's not going to scare you, I don't think. And there's a monkey who's been scared out of bejesus, and the monkey runs to one of two figures in the background there. They're a bit blurry. I'll show them to you now in just a minute. Actually, there they are. The one on the left on this slide is the one the monkey just ran to. That's covered in terry cloth. The monkey's real mother is gone, has been taken away. And there are these two surrogate mothers. One of them is cold steel, but has milk, and the other has no milk, but has warm terry cloth. And Harry Harlow tortured these monkeys and showed that they needed a little bit of touch, that they, despite the milk being on the hard, cold steel frame, the monkeys still needed the softness of the cloth. This came as a surprise. It shouldn't have come as a surprise, really. All his experiments revolved around these themes of social bonding, maternal separation, of inducing trauma into the early experience of monkeys and showing that they were very, very damaged as a result. This meant his laboratory was rather horrible. These are social isolation chambers for the monkeys, known as colloquially as the pit of despair. There was another device called the rape rack, used for forced insemination. And there were several offshoots of this. First of all, what his research found was something that nobody prior to this particular time and place would have ever doubted, which is that babies need love. Babies need attachment. The early years of a child are very, very important in forming their social bonds. But that should have been obvious to everybody. The scientist is not really contributing here, but he's responding to the fears. Now, as a result of this work in social psychology, there were some positive developments. There was the development of something called attachment theory, which emphasized the importance of the role of social contacts in early infanthood, which is very important when you consider, as we have to, children who are in orphanages, who are refugees, who are in wartime. Sometimes circumstances intervene, people get damaged, and we need to understand that damage. Harlow's work didn't contribute significantly to our understanding of that damage, but it demonstrated it for a public that needed to be reminded of something they had already known. Another offshoot of Harry Harlow's work was People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals and the Animal Liberation Front. Because of the cruelty in his laboratory with respect to animals, you would not be allowed to do these experiments today. There arose a backlash, which persists to this day, which opposes the use of animals in experiments. So Harry Harlow's a first social psychology study, which we can understand if we understand the context in which it happens. As science, it's utterly miserable. And we're going to look at two more examples in the next video.